And I think it's also a sign that Putin is quite willing to sacrifice security in the future for his mad war now.
So obviously the big news in Ukraine the last few days and around the world as well has been the possible joining of North Korean troops on the side of Russia in the war against Ukraine.
I think there's two major reasons. I mean, the first reason is geopolitical, that North Korea and Russia share a certain anti-American feeling. They both believe they are being set upon by the West, and the relationship has deepened over the last 5 years. So we know that Putin and Kim first met in 2019. Kim went to Vladivostok in 2023, then Putin went to 2024. So I think, although there was that military cooperation and another cooperation before the war, it's certainly accelerated since February 22. I think that's what you're seeing now. I think you're seeing the fruits of that relationship play out, both at strategic level, that they are both sort of become well, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So Moscow has set aside its previous racism and its sort of sense of superiority towards North Korea, and is now scrabbling around for weapons and people. So I think the second part is there's a practical reason, as part of the war, that Russia needs support, and it's found a willing partner in Mr. Kim. Throughout the Cold War, there was a relationship between the Soviet Union and North Korea, and not least during the Crimea War, during the Korean War itself in the 1950s. There was always that feeling that Russia was a great power, and that North Korea was a bit of a sort of backwater hermit kingdom basket case, and they weren't equals, because we are great Russia, these are North Koreans. But I think that's all been set aside now as part of absolute realpolitik, that Moscow needs weapons. I mean, Mr. Putin wouldn't, and his predecessors wouldn't have been seen dead with Kim and his predecessors in the past. But the fact that he's now having to go, he's gone to Pyongyang, he's sent his defence minister, he's getting weapons from them, shows how far Russia's fallen as a great power.
North Korea has been supplying ammunition, artillery shells and missiles to Russia for quite some time now. What does the escalation in terms of troops on the ground, what does that tell us about the state of the Russian army?
I read the quote in The Economist today that North Korean shells being given to Russia now broadly equate to the Russian own production. So it shows a couple of things. I mean, firstly, North Koreans have filled the gap. Notwithstanding the quality of those North Korean shells, they've filled the gap, the shell hunger, shall we say, that Russia needed. And also it shows that Russian industrial capacity hasn't been able to ramp up to fill that gap. So they've had to rely on poorer quality North Korean arms. And I understand from somebody else that these arms come and go. So it's not a constant flow. The soldiers on the front line in Ukraine report that shelling goes up when North Korean stuff arrives and goes down and it disappears. So it shows that Russia hasn't been able to provide us a sustained pipeline of shells to the front line for its artillery. But I see President Zelensky is now reporting the formation of 2 brigades of each of 6,000. So the question is, okay, I take those reports credibly. What would they do? So might they backfill the Russian army elsewhere? Possibly, to allow the Russians to release more troops. But what would they do, these troops, these North Koreans? Why put them in the Far East? Because the threat there is China. So you're then having the odd case of North Korean troops stationed in Russia, protecting Russia against China, very odd, and the Americans. So I think the logic says they're going to be used to perhaps strengthen the front line of defences inside Russia, to backfill into factories, military factories, perhaps to aid construction of defensive lines to prevent further Ukrainian incursions inside Russia, and perhaps on the front line. I mean, but of course, 6,000 to 12,000 troops at the moment is 12 days of Russian casualties. So, although the numbers are large on paper, actually, in the great scheme of things, it doesn't change much, because Russia is short of people, as we know, is scraping the barrel everywhere to try and get soldiers from wherever they can. And I think this is a temporary solution.
Is it a scenario where North Korea would send more troops?
I'd point out that it's not just like dropping North Koreans into the field and saying to get on with it. How do they fit into the system? I mean, in particular, would they work as a brigade who's got no combat experience, done very little training to be dropped in the front line against Ukrainian defenders who've been there for, well, 2.5, if not 10 years, highly experienced in attriting or causing massive Russian casualties? Or do they use them to slot into Russian units as a company or platoons working alongside Russian companies? And I think supervision would be a big problem for the Russians, because you might have North Korean troops alongside you of uncertain loyalties and capabilities, which might cause you higher casualties. And how do you talk to them? How do you control them? So again, I think we'll have to see whether they actually appear on the front line in Pokrovsk as stormtroops, or whether they're used sort of further back to release troops from inside Russia to go back into Ukraine to carry on the fight and try and grind on forward in Donbass.
There's already been some reports about North Korean troops possibly deserting. I guess that's a big risk for the North Korean army.
Well, I think it's a big risk because, if you've been living in North Korea and you're only now, a few tens of kilometres from, quote, freedom, with a very different life, a possibility, then why not? And, Ukrainian efforts might help the North Koreans to desert by killing their comrades, as we saw in the Russian army. And people come across them, but also the North Koreans will know that the treatment by the Ukrainians will be much more humane than treatment by their own side and by the Russians.
And what's in this for North Korea?
Yeah, I think the relationship goes two ways. I mean, North Korea needs technology, it needs food regularly, it needs money because it's been cut off. It's one of the poorest countries of the world. It's malnourishment, regular famines, poor infrastructure. So you can see that part of the deal being quite attractive for Mr. Kim to actually, I'll give you weapons and soldiers, you give me money, which he's getting, give me technology, give me infrastructure support, nuclear support. But of course, the key risk is proliferation risk. We know that Mr. Kim has developed his own small nuclear arsenal, his own small weapons and missiles to deliver them. I think there's a chance that Russian know-how in terms of missile technology and miniaturizing warheads would become very useful to Mr. Kim. So going back the other way, that would be advantageous to him. So both sides see it presently as a win-win. And I think it's also a sign that Putin is quite willing to sacrifice security in the future for his mad war now, whether that's security at home in terms of economic security or international security in the region.
And what about the international reaction to this? There's obviously been Kyiv and South Korea sounding the alarm. The US seems to have been a little bit more cautious in its response.
I think on the American side, it's a pattern of, because of the escalation risk, Ukraine is going to use that to say, hey, look, you've got these North Koreans coming here. We've got Russia signing deals with Iran on weapons. It's got support from China, and we need to have more relaxations of our weapons to hit these people before they attack us. And that's been played down. I saw Austin and Kiev yesterday saying the same thing, trotting out the same tired lines that there's no targets for Ukraine to hit, therefore America won't give lift restrictions on ATACMS and other weapons provided to Storm Shadow. But I think there's a wider point, of course, is the elections in 2 weeks, and everything at the moment in America is being consumed by the election between Trump and Harris. I don't think there's much spare capacity for America to do anything else, or the administration to do anything else at the moment, apart from get past that moment and then see what happens. But I think it has been rather muted, and I think it's a sort of symbol of the sort of complacency, lack of vision and sort of sense of fatalism which has sort of gripped the West over the last 2 years towards Ukraine. Its inability to really get a grasp of the situation, and if it's that important to provide Ukraine with weapons and support it needs to win the war rather than just to hang on.
Ukraine has been trying to establish a narrative of the sort of axis of evil: Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Obviously, all three are playing roles in this war in Ukraine.
And China.
Do you think this is something that the US in general needs to wake up to more?
I think there's no doubt that those nations, maybe Venezuela, Syria, are in the loop of problems to be dealt with, but are they an axis in the same way as Germany and Italy and Japan were in World War II? I don't think so. I think, as I said, for BRICS, each of those has different goals. We could talk about the Russian-North Korean relationship, the Russian-Iranian relationship, but the Russian-Iranian relationship affects Russia's relationship with Saudi Arabia, particularly the United Arab Emirates. The Russia-China relationship, I think, is not equal. China has Russia over a barrel, literally, an oil barrel, because of the disparity of wealth and Russia's obvious desperation to forge new relationships. So, yes, we have to deal with these threats, whether they're emerging or current, but I think trying to paint them all as one big, massive, Nazi-style, communist-style international plot to bring the West down is probably a stretch. And I think that gives opportunities for the West to deal with some of the issues around those nations individually, not just trying to deal with it collectively. And I think Ukraine is in a very difficult position. It's got lots of it's been buffeted by winds from lots of directions. Russia's obvious personnel and human superiority, the difficulty of the United States, differences in Europe, China, whatever. I just think that probably at the moment the best case scenario is that Ukraine clings on over the winter Harris wins and the support continues. But I think over the next 2 weeks we'll find out which way that goes and whether the United States disgracefully under Trump would back away from it, which I think wouldn't just damage just Ukraine severely and lead it to sue for peace, but I think would damage American reputation for leadership for generations.